Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. In our last video, we saw the children of Israel go from Mount Sinai into the Promised Land. We saw how Moses had led the children of Israel from Mount Sinai. They went up to the borders of the Canaan land, and when they spied out the land, because only 2 of the spies brought back a positive report and 10 brought back a negative report, the people lost faith, and so it was because of their unbelief they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But at the end of that 40 years, they were once again ready to go into the Canaan land. They'd already conquered the kings on the east side of the Jordan. And now Moses goes up on the Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, where God shows him all the Canaan land before he dies. An interesting thing is it says that God buried Moses, and no man knew where his tomb. Now, we're not told specifically why, but the logical conclusion is that if the children of Israel had known where Moses was buried or had his tomb, that they would no doubt have made it a place of worship. And so God kept that secret. And so Joshua then receives the leadership, and Joshua takes the people across the Jordan. They conquer Jericho, Ai, and the other central parts of the Canaan land. They conquered the southern part of the land. They had a northern campaign, and then they divided the land among the 12 tribes. Now we're told in Joshua chapter 21 that the promises God had made to Abraham about giving this land into his descendants were fulfilled. It said not a word failed of all the things that God had promised, that he kept them all. And we're also told that the children of Israel, that they were faithful to God throughout the days of Joshua and throughout the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all God's great works, how he had brought them out of Egypt, brought them to Sinai, saw his wonders in the wilderness, and now had seen the victories of the Canaan land. But after the death of Joshua and these elders, we enter into an unstable time in Israel's history. Now, we've mentioned before that the book of Genesis tells us, first 11 chapters, about the history of the world. The rest of Genesis tells us about the family of Abraham. Then when we get to Exodus, of course, tells how they left Egypt. And then the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy tells us about this time, along with Exodus, of the children of Israel at Sinai, their wilderness wanderings, up to the time that they enter Canaan. Now, Joshua, which actually tells about the actual contest, is the first book of history. Those first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are the books of the law. But now Joshua is the first book of history, and the second book of history is Judges. Again, Judges tells us about this very unstable time. The verse you find throughout the book of Judges, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So they didn't have any central governing authority at that time. And this is the cycle that you see throughout the book of Judges. That is, that the people would sin, and God would allow them to become servants of their enemy. When they become sorrowful, he'd send them salvation. And so this continual cycle of sin, servitude, sorrow, and salvation is found throughout the book of Judges. Now, their oppression came from different peoples. We're told that it came as far as even the people of Mesopotamia came down against God's people, and even the people from the land of Midian came and oppressed God's people. But most of the oppression came from their immediate neighbors, because you remember that in looking at the Canaan land to the south of the Dead Sea, you had the Edomites, you had the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Syrians to the northeast, and you had the Phoenicians along the seashore. And here to the southwest, you had a big, strong people called the Philistines. Now, we're going to see them as oppressors in the time of the Judges, and they continue to be the principal enemies of Israel throughout the reign of Saul, who's going to be the first king of Israel, and even in the days of David. It's not until the time of David that these Philistines are finally going to be subdued. And then when these different oppressions come, God is going to rise up these individuals: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jerah, Jephthah, Bezan, Elon, Abidan, and of course Samson. And you know, some of those names are more familiar than others. Now, in between here, right after Gideon, there was a man by the name of Abimelech who actually became king for a short time, but he was a wicked man that had killed some of his own family, and God eventually brought judgment upon him. But these were the judges that God used to deliver his people from their oppression. It's during the time of Judges that also the book of Ruth falls. The book of Ruth would have taken place during this time. And the last judge is going to be Samuel, and this gets into the next historical book when you get into the book of 1 Samuel. At that time, we find that Eli is the priest of God, that the tabernacle is set up in Shiloh, but unfortunately Eli was a bad father and his sons were bad men. But Samuel was a good boy who was raised in the tabernacle in service to God, and he became a great leader in Israel, because Samuel was not only a priest, he was also a prophet and a judge. But it was then in his days that the children of Israel began to say that they wanted a king to rule them like all the other nations. And so this is then going to lead us into the time known as the United Kingdom. And this United Kingdom is going to stand for 120 years. It's only going to have 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, and each of them will reign for 40 years, making up that 120 years of the United Kingdom. Now, when Saul became king, he was a very humble man at first. He was a big man. It said that he was a head and shoulders among other people. He looked like a leader. But unfortunately, very shortly after he became king, he was guilty of direct disobedience to God, to the point where God had rejected him as being king and told Samuel then to anoint David as the next king. Now, David didn't begin reigning right away because Saul's going to fulfill his 40 years as king over Israel. And it's kind of sad to see the decline of Saul, that he just continually declines throughout his lifetime, going further away from God until we reach to the last chapter of the book of 1 Samuel, in 1 Samuel 31, where Saul and his sons are killed, and then David becomes king. David's going to reign first in the city of Hebron for 7 years, and later all Israel will approach David and ask him to become king. So then David becomes king over all of Israel, all the tribes, for 33 years, making up the 40 years of his reign. It's David who takes Zion, which was a Jebusite stronghold in the mountains, and David and his men captured Zion, which became Jerusalem. And although the city of Jerusalem was going to grow and expand throughout history, that initial part, that Mount Zion, is always going to be referred to as the city of David. Of course, David is famous for he brings the ark to Jerusalem, but God does not allow him to build the temple because it said he was a man of war. But what he did is God used him to subdue all the neighboring nations, and to accumulate great wealth, to kind of set the stage for the reign of his son Solomon, who would become perhaps the greatest king that reigned in Israel. It's unfortunate that you study about David, and the first part of his life is nothing but victory, and God, as I said, used him to subdue all the neighbors of Israel. But most people are familiar with David's sin with Bathsheba, and unfortunately, after that sin, we kind of see a decline in David. That David got forgiveness for sin. He's described as a man after God's own heart, so he did humble himself and repent of his sin. So he got forgiveness of sin, but it teaches us an important lesson, that we can get forgiveness of sin, but we can never escape the consequences of sin. He ended up losing 3 sons. The child that was born to Bathsheba died. He later lost a son, Ammon, and then later he lost his beloved son, Absalom. And that's just one of the price that he had to pay, one of the consequences, you might say, for his sin. As I mentioned, that his efforts set the stage for the reign of his son Solomon. And Solomon, at would be king, and the Bible says that this was the zenith. This is when the nation of Israel reached its greatest point, because they reigned clear from the borders of Egypt, clear to the Euphrates River. All other nations paid tribute to them. We know that Solomon was very young and humble when he was first anointed king, and because that he asked for wisdom, that God made him the wisest man to ever live. That is, of course, second only to Jesus himself. But it was Solomon who was charged with building the temple in Jerusalem, and there's some fascinating things we read about. He was one of the first. He rose a workforce. He even they quarried stones underneath Jerusalem for the building of the temple. But one of the another great thing that he did, he raised a task force, workforce, and this was the first swing shift you read about in history, because this workforce was 30,000 men, and they would go 10,000 at a time up to Tyre. And this was where Hiram, who had been a friend of David, King Hiram, helped Solomon in the building of the temple and eventually his house as well, because this was the area known for the famous cedars of Lebanon. But what they would do is, so they would send 10,000 men to work at a time, 20 at home, and they would rotate. But what they do, they would cut these trees down, they would float them down the Mediterranean Sea to Joppa, and then bring them overland to the temple. And it says that it took David 7 years to build that glorious temple in Jerusalem, and that's going to be the temple that's going to stand until it's eventually destroyed by the Babylonians hundreds of years later. But it's interesting that it says that it took Solomon 7 years to build the Lord's house, but it took him 13 years to build his own house. So that was pretty elaborate as well. Another famous thing that Solomon did, he was the only king of Israel that had a navy. You don't think of Israel as being a naval. The people like here in Phoenicia, they were seafaring people. Well, again, the Phoenicians helped Solomon, and they came and they built a naval base here in this city of Ezion-Geber. This is on the Red Sea. The Red Sea is down here, and you have the one branch known as the Suez, and this was of course the Sea of Aqaba. And so Ezion-Geber was built here, and Solomon, his fleet of ships would go out, and they would sail out to faraway places and bring back exotic animals and great treasures. One of the great mysteries of the Bible, it says that they went to the land of Ophir, where there's gold. We don't know where that is, whether it was along the coast of Africa, maybe even South Africa, or somewhere in India. It's just one of the great mysteries. But they would sail off and bring these great treasures back. And we know what the Queen of Sheba said, who journeyed a great way to see the wealth and the knowledge of Solomon. It said that when she got and saw his kingdom and all the glory, she said, the half has not yet been told. So this was an important time in Israel's history, but unfortunately, it said that Solomon married many foreign women. He had a harem that you couldn't believe, because it said that he had 300 wives and 700 concubines or something. But it was like, it said that these foreign wives in his old age, that they turned his heart away, and he actually became unfaithful to God. And this was going to lead to another important time in history, because after this United Kingdom is going to stand for 120 years, there's going to be a division. 10 tribes will rebel and start the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes will establish the southern kingdom of Judah. And that'll be the subject of our next study. So I hope that this video has been informative, and I hope you'll join me again.